So it's really important when you're going to put your borders on to actually measure the quilt in several different spots. So for example, we need to get the width of this to put your border on. So you're wanting to get the length of the border here. So measure it in several different spots. Just kind of make sure you've got the quilt stretched out nicely. So measure it from the top, along the top sword. That's 53.5. Measure it here. That's 53. That's 53. That's 53.25. So I would probably go 53. The biggest problem that people make is that they actually cut a border and then just start to sew on, and then when they get to the end, cut it off. That's not a good practice to be in, because you'll get a kind of a skew-if quilt with the border. So you really have to be very precise with your border. So with this, because you've had 2 or 3 53s, you'd cut a border of 53. So just remember that. So once you've put your 2 borders, side borders on, and you've got them all nice and flat and ironed, then you turn your border, your whole quilt around with your borders on, and you measure once again 3 or 4 times across the quilt and get your, you know, if you've got 2 at 46 and 2 at 46.5 and 1 at 46.75, I'd go 46.5. So really important that you do that, because you'll end up with a nice perfect quilt. I'm going to move on to the borders. So what you have to do is, once again, it's a quilt as a go. So you put your, as per instructions, it gives you the sizes in there. This is the backing. And then you put your wadding on top of that. So the backing and the wadding are slightly wider and longer than your actual front material. Make sure that's all flat. And then right side's up. So you need to put the back side down. Onto the top there. Just centre it. Then give it a good iron, because it's the Hobbs heirloom fusible wadding. It's basically, it'll stick to the front and the back. So good iron on the front, and then turn it over. Make sure there's no creases in the back, and then a good iron on the back. What we're going to do now is we're going to draw up a grid for quilting. So we're going to quilt this block or border, and then we're going to add it to the side of your quilts. So these are your side borders. With your chalk pencil and your ruler, start just 2 inches. Come in 2 inches and just draw lines at 2 inches. So go right across the quilt and draw the lines in at 2 inches. So on and so forth. So I've got one here that I've actually finished quilting, which, as you can see, it is quilted all the way across at 2-inch increments. I haven't trimmed it back as yet. Give that a really good iron, front and back, just so that you can stretch it out to its maximum for when you actually measure it to cut it back. Right now, this is ready to get cut back to the size that we've specified in the actual instructions. which for me was 53.5 inch. That's all of my blocks added together plus the sashing. So I'm going to cut this back to 53.5. So the measurements I gave you for the actual borders is slightly larger the whole way around, because when you quilt it, it kind of brings it in a little bit. So now you've got to cut down this quilted border to 53.5 by 6.5. So to start off with, trim this off, make sure you've got your a line along the bottom of that. Trim this off so we've got a nice straight start. Turn this around. And then you need to measure 53.5 inches from there. So, as always, measure twice, cut once, because if you cut it wrong, it's going to be a disaster. You have to do it all over again. So 53.5, I'll get that to 53.5, double check it again. Always double check it, maybe stretch that out a little bit to see if it's okay. 53.5, line up your line at the bottom of the material. Remove that so you don't cut that in half when you're cutting it. And that's it, 53.5. Now we have to do the 6.5. So this was a 7-inch. So we have to do a 6.5. So it was 53.5 by 6.5 inch wide. So what I do is I've got this long ruler. We use them all in the shop. I think it's a 23.5 or 23.5 or 24.5. It's that worn, as you can see. But this is 6.5 inch wide. Line up the bottom along that slice that you've just taken off, and center it in the middle. So you're cutting a bit off each side. So just do one side first, pulling it forward. Turn your board this way so it makes it a bit easier. Get a bit more of a longer cut. Line up, don't go right up to the top here where you've stopped cutting. Come down about, I don't know, 10 inches or so that you know that you're getting a straight edge then. Line up that edge there. Check, yes, it's all still sitting okay, it's pretty centered. And then bring it down the last bit. So line up 10 or so inches there, if not a little bit more. And so you're getting a nice straight cut. Get rid of that, then we'll turn it around. So the straight of your ruler will be on that edge there. Sometimes you have to sort of move the border around to make it sit underneath the outside of the actual ruler. Bring it down. So you can do a bit longer cut because you've got the straight on this edge here. So that's how you cut back your border to the size that you want. Oops. Right. So that's your border ready to be attached to the side of your actual quilt. So I'll just get set up for that and get back to you. So now we want to attach the border to the side of our quilt. And as usual, we start with the spacer bar on the back of the quilt, attach that to the back like we did our other sashings in between these blocks. So you can just attach this. I generally, if I've cut it, this spacer bar is cut at 53.5, I would pin one end and then I'd go, make sure I've got it the right way. So, because it's right, the back, it's right sides together, even though it's on the back of the quilt, the fabric is right sides together. And then just make sure, just sort of stretch it out and get it all sitting correct. Kind of move your hand along, get your middle, and then just pin the rest of it. So now we'll take that to the sewing machine and we'll sew that on. So we've attached that spacer bar to the back like that, and then just iron it up all flat like that so that we can attach this border. So the border, once again, you just take it from the corner, basically pin both sides on the outside and then work your way into the middle so that you've got it all evenly pinned. Stretch it out and pin it from the middle. All right, so I'll sew that on and then we'll put the sasha over the top. So I've attached the border to the spacer at the back, and that spacer is attached to the quilt. I forgot to mention that it's a 1/4 inch seam on those two seams there, just to keep everything within its, you know, like everything's got 1/4 inch seams, so it's all fixed together. So now we just give that a bit of a press, give those seams a bit of a press. Okay, and we're going to put on a 53.5 inch sasha. So you use your glue, just do it a bit at a time, maybe, you know, 1 block or 2 blocks at a time. Stick it on, just covering that seam line that you've just sewn, attaching that sasha on, the spacer on the back, so just cover that. Do one side first. It doesn't matter if a bit of that glue comes up because it actually dries clear, so you don't have to worry about if you make a bit of a mess with the glue, don't worry about that. Right. Just make sure you're covering that little seam there. Okay, come back and do the other side now. And when you iron it, stretch out that border so that you get the maximum spacer on the back and you haven't got a bulging spacer at the back. Ready to iron. And set that glue. So now this is ready to go to the machine, and with your monopoly, sew down each end. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you how to grid that out. It's the same as this, but just make sure you basically take that 2 inches in the middle. So you may as well do that while you've got it flat like this rather than bringing it back to the to your desk or to your sewing table. Just make sure that you put those first the 2 inch ones there and then work. What you can do is just measure in between, like that works out there at about 11 3/4. So I would kind of just do just underneath 2 inches so you can space out evenly. You haven't got 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1.5. So if you just take it just under 2, and you'll find that it'll come out quite nicely. There's measurements sort of 1 7/8 almost. Yep, that's fine. And then cross hatch it like we did, exactly the same as what we did for these actual sashings there. So I'll come back, I'll go and sew the side on there with the monopoly. We'll quilt it all. We've come to adding the top and the bottom border, and as you can see with the top border, there's actually like a little square in the corner, so that's the square there. What I've done is, as per my instructions, it's got the right width that you actually have to sew together as a border and then quilt, but you've had to make up these 4 6.5 inch squares, and they're actually 7 inch squares, and you've got to trim that back to 6.5 and add it with your spacer bar to the back, the spacer bar on the back, and your sashing over the top to form like this. And do the quilting, and just the crisscross kind of quilting, the same quilting as what we did in the sashing of the quilt. So do the quilting before you actually add the border to it. If you've not done a 12 1/4 inch block, you'll need to measure your quilt. So just remember, measure it at several different places to check the size. And if they all come up around about the same, check. So they're both 55, so we'll just keep going. Just measure it at 3 or 4 different spaces just to get an idea of whether you've got the right width border, because you don't want your quilt to go skew-if. So what I'm going to do, I've actually got a finished one of these borders here, and I'm going to show you how to put the border on, because what we need to do is line up that sashing again. So just iron over your spacer, and so that you get that nice crisp iron over. And then we've got to line up this last border. With this sashing. So this is the finished one. Yep, that's the finished one. So just put it on the top here and make sure that you're lining up with that, because once again, with the eye, when you're looking at it, you'll see, if you're looking at it hanging, you want it to have a nice visual so it looks like it's a straight line. So just line up that first and go to the other side and line up this one so it lines up with your sashing, and then pin the rest. So what I'll do is I'll pin the rest and I'll sew it, and I'll sew the other border on, and we'll nearly finished our quilt, and we'll go to the very next step, which is binding.